Isn't this gag order, isn't the horse already left the barn? There's already massive, widespread speculation about this case.
There's already widespread, massive speculation, but there is a mountain of evidence that we don't know about yet.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Just a few hours ago, News Nation's Elizabeth Vargas said to Ashleigh Banfield, well, basically, since there's already widespread speculation going on anyway, why not lift the gag order? Kind of like the damage is done. Why doesn't the court just sort of let the media run with it? It's kind of an admission that they're involved in the sort of thing you want to try to protect trials from. Well, if you're a judge, and typically the defense don't like the intrusion of cameras either. I have to say the fact that Koberger doesn't want cameras in the courtroom makes me want to support the cause for them. But clearly there are other interests at heart. Right now, I want to talk about the mainstream media, and specifically those on News Nation. We know them well, don't we? If you know true crime, if you've read books on true crime, if you've followed true crime over the years, we've come a long road with these faces, these voices, these minds. Vargas and Banfield are legal journalists with very lengthy backgrounds, also very respectable reputations. I mean, I've studied Vargas's interviews going all the way back to the Ramseys and Scott Peterson. That's decades. And so this is Ashleigh's response. She says, there's a mountain of evidence we don't know about yet. That may be true, but let's not forget it's primarily the job of a criminal court going into trial to study evidence, not the media and social media. And if you remember in the Chris Watts case, it was kind of at the moment of sentencing that all of those documents, all of the discovery was dumped. I sort of feel that is appropriate. That's the appropriate time to release the discovery. That's personally just how I feel. Banfield admits herself to being fascinated by the debate going on regarding the gag order. First Amendment, in other words, free speech, versus the Sixth Amendment, the right to a fair trial. What the court does, what the court tries to do, is accommodate both. What the media does is insist, well, what it really does is demands the First Amendment. We have the right to everything about this trial. We have the right to know everything. And that is because it's the media's job to generate content. But the thing is, people aren't content, right? People aren't content. And so the way the media sees it, it's like people aren't people, they're content. Incidentally, the top most psychopathic professions, right? If you want to really look at that aspect, if you want to use the word psychopath as well, journalists score directly above police officers, but lawyers are also near the top of that list. And I think when we're thinking about media access, I think there's something that is quite psychopathic about it. There's also something quite narcissistic about it. I want this, I should have this, and I'm not really even going to think about other people or other interests at heart. Well, maybe we should. And so if you don't mind, I'd like to talk about this idea of access and transparency, which, those are very nice sounding words, but it's really about the right to know the personal details, the private text, the personal pictures. Basically, I want the right to invade the private lives of others within the sort of schema of a trial. And some of these texts are they may have a criminal component, they may be from the perpetrator, but many of them are from the victims. And don't they have certain rights? Many are perhaps from the victim's friends. And we are dealing with a student community. That is what is so idiosyncratic about this crime. And so I'd like to talk about this idea of access, not as a psychopathic YouTube creator that just wants his own pound of flesh, but as a sensitive, critical thinker, someone who's covered true crime for a long time, someone who also cares about the fabric of society And, we want to restore that fabric of society that's been torn. Is this the way of going about it? I mean, we don't want to let the tear in society that the alleged perpetrator here, possibly Koberger, we don't want to let that tear caused by a crime, a very vicious crime, become a sort of add insult to injury scenario. But isn't that what is kind of happening here? And that is the media and social media's forte, adding insult to injury. So the argument I've been trying to make is that the fairness argument, the right to a fair trial, also extends, and I think should extend, beyond the defendant and his rights to also the rights of other people that are related to this case. Does that make sense? Before we continue our analysis here, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, you can see I have a totally different approach to most. I was also in Moscow, also went there, took photos, walked around, got a feel for the place. Kind of quietly, just kind of got a feel for the place. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button. And let's continue. So maybe you don't know, but if you go to Moscow, right, if you go to the trouble to actually go there, you may actually find that there are an inordinate number of young people there. I think it's the population of that town is something like 20,000, so it's already a small town, kind of like Boulder in a sense. And then about half of that town are students, about 10,000, give or take, kind of like Boulder as well. And when you move through that fabric, you can tell that this, because it's quite a small community, this crime is, and it's something that doesn't happen often, has really shaken and traumatized this community. Do people feel safe? Do people feel they can trust one another? And how do they feel when someone from the media comes there and, for the sole purpose of tragedy of mining, but basically for the sole purpose of reminding them, of what has happened? And I'm not saying you should forget about what has happened, but by the same token, that is not the sole tourist attraction of Moscow. It's actually a very quaint, beautiful little town. And so, do you remember in January of this year, about 6 months ago, Nancy Grace she kind of put a desk right in front of the house. This was before it was boarded up. And she was sitting right outside the crime scene tape, and she was sort of making that her reporting studio, if you will. And so what the students did was basically say, "Fuck you, Nancy Grace." And Barstool, Idaho, tweeted exactly that, right? So that is how the kids there, this is their community, these are their neighborhoods, this is what happened to their friends, and this is how they feel about the media. So do you think the students and the university, do you think they support the gag order? Do you think they want the gag order? And if they do, this community wants it, if the students want to be able to study without all of this nonsense, basically, all of the chatter and speculation constantly going on prior to the trial. It's okay if it goes on during the trial, but prior to the trial, when, they've got exams to write, is that very helpful? So, as I say, I'm going to give this subject matter another go round, if you don't mind. So, first of all, I want to deal with the question, does the media guarantee a fair trial? And what I want you to do right now is write your answer in the comments. And I'll also put a link to Ashleigh Banfield addressing this very question on News Nation. And what do you think she thinks about that? What do you think the media think? Do you think that the media feel them being present is going to kind of guarantee a fair trial? They're going to make sure that everything is looked at or whatever. Well, I've got to say, once upon a time, I thought that it did. When I covered the Oscar Pistorius case around about 10 years ago, I thought, with the world watching, what could go wrong? And guess what? Things went spectacularly wrong. The judge got the original verdict spectacularly wrong, with everybody watching, with everybody reporting. And you know what? A lot of the original journalists, also a lot of the pundits, got their assessment of her verdict wrong as well. So the media doesn't guarantee a fair trial. The groupthink is real. And so in her interview, Banfield refers to O.J. Simpson, Casey Anthony, and Jodi Arias. I've written a trilogy on each or more on each of those cases. In Casey Anthony's case, 2 books, and I kind of got interrupted while I was writing the third because the Chris Watts case happened. But, I've covered those cases in depth, so I know about those. And Banfield does too. And she says, despite massive media coverage, OJ and Casey were acquitted. But I mean, doesn't that prove that massive media coverage doesn't guarantee anything? So my response to that is the same as what we saw in the Oscar Pistorius case. Media coverage doesn't guarantee a conviction, or let's say the quote-unquote right verdict. I'm not sure if it helps nudge it in that direction. I think it can. I think it often does. I also don't think any of those cases are very relevant to the media landscape today. I really don't think, talking about O.J. Simpson, which happened in the 90s, Casey Anthony, which happened, more than 10 years ago, these are, in terms of the media landscape, ancient cases. I think if you want to talk about the impact of the media on a trial, please talk about Depp versus Heard. Talk about a case that led to a virtual trial by internet, aka trial by TikTok. Hashtag Justice for Johnny Depp garnered about 33 billion views, which is more than 4 times the total number of people on this planet. That's what happens when you allow televisions into the courtroom, or that's what can happen, lest we forget. And that was not a case that should have been televised. Would you say that the mixed verdict in Depp versus Heard is a demonstration of the media helping to bring about the right to a just outcome? Would you? I wouldn't. So Banfield's argument is that the biggest trial she's covered, O.J. and Casey Anthony, and I would say Depp versus Heard dwarfs those, makes those look like tiny little pipsqueak cases. We're talking about 33 billion views of a particular hashtag, right? O.J. was basically pre-social media. She's saying that those cases didn't have gag orders, so why should this one? I don't think the argument works. Perhaps if there was a gag order for those cases, we may have a different or better outcome. I mean, the outcomes in both those trials were kind of shocking, were kind of disappointing. So if you had a gag order, maybe you would have had a less shocking, less disappointing result. God knows, once upon a time, the biggest underminer when it came to prosecuting cases were PR narratives, the PR counter-narrative. Well, guess who puts those into play? The media. Which famous cases involve the media and PR narratives? Amanda Knox, Madeleine McCann, John Benet Ramsey, O.J. Simpson, Casey Anthony, and a lot of that from the Casey Anthony case was narratives that her parents kind of put into play. Well, guess who orchestrated that? Who allowed that to happen? And then also the West Memphis 3 case and Stephen Avery. So how many cases is that? Amanda Knox 1, Madeleine McCann 2, John Benet Ramsey 3, O.J. 4, Casey Anthony 5, West Memphis 3, 6, Stephen Avery 7. Of those 7 cases which had a satisfactory result, I would argue only 1. According to CBS News, and this is dealing with the Casey Anthony case, quote, immediately after Casey Anthony was acquitted on charges that she killed her 2-year-old daughter, Kaylee, Casey's defense attorney chided the media for presuming guilt long before the case ever went to trial. And then CBS News legal consultant Jack Ford, he said, this was hardly the first time media coverage of a trial reached a fever pitch. It was only the latest example of justice as entertainment. Well, that's exactly where we're going with the Idaho case. Also, I met someone during the trial of Lori Vallow who said she found herself becoming a voyeur and taking kind of a voyeuristic interest in the case, but dealing with things like human remains. And then she realized, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be that person. And she stopped attending trial. She said, leave that to the journalists. What's also interesting is the relative responses from the victims' families to the gag order. On the one side, you have the Chapins, who seem to want to ignore the trial. We're going to talk about that approach soon enough. On the other side, you have Kaylee's family, who want to actively participate in it. There's also some other family members that seem to be kind of in a drug-addled state to some extent and don't seem to know kind of what's going on or want to know or be in a position to know. But anyway, Kaylee's father, and I say that with sympathy, by the way, Kaylee's father, you may remember, was a staunch critic of law enforcement. He kept sort of, what's the word, I don't want to say interfering, but he kept intruding into the narrative, demanding to know what was going on. And on the one hand, you could sympathize with that because of what had happened to his daughter. On the other hand, what was actually going on is law enforcement were playing their cards close to their chest deliberately because they were actually closing in on their suspect. And they needed to concentrate on that, and they needed to do their jobs, and they did. Do you think what Kaylee's father was doing was helping law enforcement not drop the ball? In the Lori Vallow case, there was no gag order. In the Lori Vallow case, no gag order really seemed necessary because no one really seemed to want to talk to the media anyway. But just to be clear, there was a gag order. But, I mean, there was a situation where, there were Mormons and the people didn't really want to talk about it, including family members. And those who did basically only spoke to LDS-type journalists. Also didn't get a sense that the media, this is after the trial, even wanted to talk or have the conversation that was at the center of the Vallow case, which is misguided extreme beliefs. But Ashleigh Banfield makes an excellent point by saying that the prosecutors are effectively the victim's family lawyers in this situation, but the gag order means that they're excluded from the process. There could be kind of some valuable interactions and there could be some valuable exchanges. But I think if we want to know the evidence in this case, you can imagine how the family members feel. They want to know what happened to the daughters they lost more than 10 months ago now. Now, on a personal note, I can tell you I was under kind of unofficial gag order myself. After my friend Alex was killed in a horrible way while mountain biking near his home in Johannesburg, I wanted to bring attention to it. I could and I wanted to attend the trial and participate, advise, help in any way that I could. But the family wanted to keep it private. They have their reasons, and I respected them, but understand how it feels being left out of something when you lose someone in such tragic circumstances and no one tells you anything. It does add insult to injury. In sum, I would say there isn't a one-size-fits-all scenario in terms of media access. I will say that in my personal professional opinion, as an expert who's covered true crime for about a decade, I'd say high-profile cases need to be protected from the monster that social media has become. Not is becoming or threatens to become, it's already there. We're already at that point. And so especially in jury trial scenarios where the jury goes home at the end of each day and they pick up their smartphones, I think high-profile cases need to be protected. In other words, there needs to be a default setting from now on to restrict the media when it comes to high-profile cases in particular. There's a difference between a high-profile trial and any trial. There's a difference. You could televise an ordinary trial and no one would watch it. Not the same with a high-profile case where no one can stop watching. And so when there are young people, young lives, and young witnesses involved, and I can't remember a case where that was more the case than this one, perhaps the Amanda Knox case, which is also a student case, then I think that the need to cut off the head of the social media snake is even more necessary. In future, I foresee a scenario where American jurors will be legally mandated to hand over their smartphones. It'll be necessary to actually prove, to enforce the separation between a juror and the possible toxic influence, that sort of insidious influence of social media. Because it's going to become increasingly obvious that trying to sequestrate jurors from social media during trials is both unrealistic and unlikely. And that really is... that situation really is allowing the court of social media, the court of public opinion, to trump the actual court. That can't be allowed to happen. But I firmly believe it is happening. And so I do think we do, even as a YouTube creator, I really see bad things taking place, and we do need to start having rules and restrictions because it is getting worse and worse. Do you agree? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.